The men cast the CEO into an abandoned gas station, then a single dad whispered, "Stay quiet." 3 black SUVs forced CEO Celeste Whitmore's car off the highway in the middle of a cold mountain rainstorm, with no cell signal, no backup, and nowhere left to turn. She made it on foot to an abandoned gas station at the edge of a forgotten Pennsylvania back road, certain the crumbling building was her only chance at survival. But the headlights behind her didn't keep moving. They stopped just outside the door, engines idling like something patient and deliberate. Then a hand reached out from the darkness, grabbed her by the sleeve, and dragged her down behind the counter before she could make a sound. A man in a grease-stained work jacket pressed one finger to his lips and whispered just 3 words: "Stay quiet." His name was Rowan Hale, a single father rebuilding a dead gas station, and he already knew exactly what those men outside had come to take. If you believe the forgotten ones sometimes save the most powerful people in the room, stay with this story until the very last light comes on. The message came to Celeste Whitmore's private encrypted line at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and the sender was a name she hadn't heard from in 72 hours. Elliot Crane, the company's internal auditor, had vanished from his office 3 days earlier, without a leave request, without forwarding his calls, and without telling a single assistant where he was going. His keycard had never been deactivated, and his credentials were still live on the Whitmore Crown Development server. But his desk had been cleared so quickly that 2 colleagues assumed he'd been let go. The message was short, stripped of corporate formality, and it asked Celeste to drive alone to a place called Hale's Last Stop, an abandoned gas station off a 2-lane state road in the Pennsylvania foothills. At midnight, telling absolutely no one in senior management where she was headed. Elliot claimed he had documentation proving that Silver Ridge, the $1.2 billion resort and conference complex Celeste had staked her first year as CEO on, was not a development deal at all. It was a trap designed to drain the company's reserves, force a default, and deliver Whitmore Crown into outside hands at a fraction of its real value. She didn't call Archer Pembroke, her chief operating officer, because Elliot's message was explicit. The person helping orchestrate this sits in executive meetings. She didn't alert her security detail. She did, as a single concession to caution, send her GPS coordinates to Marin Holloway, her private legal counsel. Then she put on her coat and drove into the rain. The road out of the city was familiar for the first 40 miles. And then it narrowed and the streetlights disappeared, leaving only wet gray asphalt and the sound of rain against the glass. Celeste noticed the first set of headlights holding its distance but matching her speed, and she told herself it was coincidence until a second pair materialized behind the first. By the time a third SUV appeared from a side road and slid into formation ahead of her, she understood that someone had already known exactly where she was going. Her cell signal dropped all at once, not fading but vanishing, the way a signal vanishes when something is actively blocking it. Her navigation system glitched and rerouted her in a loop, and she switched it off and drove from memory. The lead SUV crossed her lane without warning, forcing her toward the gravel shoulder, and she held the wheel and didn't brake, because braking would have sent her into the guardrail. She found a gap, turned hard off the main road, and pushed the car down a dirt track she didn't recognize until a rusted sign caught her headlights. Hale's Last Stop, 1/4 mile. The front tire found the drainage ditch at the edge of the property, and the car lurched and went still. Celeste grabbed her folder, stepped into the rain, and ran. The station emerged from the dark in pieces, the curved overhang above the pump island, 2 old-style pumps with their hoses missing, a low building with boarded side windows, and a single door with a cracked pane of glass. No lights, no sign of Elliot Crane, no sound except the rain and the distant thrum of engines somewhere behind her on the road. She crossed the pump island in a crouch, and reached the door and put her hand on the knob, and the door opened from the inside, and a forearm shot across her shoulder blades and pulled her through the doorway and into absolute darkness before she had time to call out. The man who pulled her in didn't speak for 30 seconds, and in that silence Celeste became aware of three things. The floor was concrete, the air smelled like motor oil, and the hand on her shoulder was guiding her deliberately lower rather than holding her down. A narrow beam of light appeared at floor level, and she saw a rectangular opening cut into the concrete. A vehicle inspection pit, roughly 6 feet deep and barely wide enough for two adults side by side. The man lowered himself in first, reached up for her arm, and waited. She took the hand. He was tall and solidly built, wearing a canvas work jacket with a torn left pocket, and his face in the brief light was calm in the way of someone who has worked in crisis long enough to stop performing composure. He set the light face down and pressed one finger to his lips and said in a voice no louder than breath, "Stay quiet." Then he drew a sheet of heavy corrugated metal across the opening above them, and the world went dark. The voices came within 2 minutes. Celeste counted 4 sets of footsteps above her, 3 moving around the perimeter and 1 standing just inside the door, issuing instructions in a low, controlled tone she recognized immediately. The voice belonged to Gavin Rourke, Whitmore Crown's Director of Corporate Security. A man she had approved for the role 14 months ago, a man who had stood in her lobby that very morning. He called her name twice. He said there was nothing to be afraid of, that he was here to escort her back to the city safely, in the exact tone of someone who has rehearsed the line and practiced keeping the implication out of it. Rowan reached into a narrow shelf on the pit wall and found a flat, rectangular device salvaged from an old CB radio. He pressed one button. In the storage annex at the back of the building, a mechanical bell sounded twice. The kind of alert bell older service stations used when a vehicle crossed a pressure hose. 3 of the 4 sets of footsteps shifted immediately toward the rear. While they moved, Rowan pressed a second button, and the device crackled with a recorded loop of a highway patrol dispatch call, a unit calling in a traffic stop 3 miles east, close enough to make any rational person reassess whether staying was worth the exposure. The footsteps near the back door hesitated. Then Gavin's voice, stripped now of its careful reassurance, said 5 words to the man beside him. "Without Whitmore, tomorrow's vote is easy." The back door opened. The engines on the road pulled away. Rowan had positioned a small recording device at the lip of the pit with the microphone angled upward, and its indicator light was still red. He counted to 60 before he moved the metal sheet aside. Celeste was already standing, holding a flathead screwdriver from a bracket on the pit wall, pointing it at him with the specific steadiness of someone who has decided the gesture is necessary. She asked, in a voice not quite even, why he already knew the name of the man who'd just been standing on the floor above them. Rowan set the recording device on the counter and answered her without preamble. The men from those SUVs had been coming to this property for just over 2 months. Not always Gavin himself, sometimes 2 men in company jackets who gave no names, sometimes a lawyer with a manila envelope, once a county official with paperwork. Rowan was fairly certain had been filed without required signatures. They all wanted the same thing. He should sell the land to a company called Crestfall Holdings at roughly 40% of its assessed value, and the transaction should be completed before the end of the quarter. He had looked up Crestfall Holdings when the first letter arrived and found no public employees, no web presence, and a registered address at a law firm that specialized in real estate acquisitions structured through intermediary entities. He hadn't sold because the price was an insult, and because he hadn't finished what he came here to do. His father had built Hale's last stop in the early 1970s and run it for 30 years before the state rerouted the main highway 4 miles west, taking nearly all the through traffic with it. The station had gone dormant before his father died, But the property had passed to Rowan with something close to a condition: keep the lights on. After his wife June died, the illness had taken 2 years to take her. Rowan had left a reasonable job maintaining emergency communications infrastructure and come back to the station because it was the last project June had believed in completely. She had drawn sketches on napkins and index cards, all variations on the same idea: garage, counter, coffee, a radio relay for travelers on the long stretch where no one knew where you were. He had not been able to honor those sketches while they were still fresh. He had also not been able to sell the building to a holding company with no name and no face. Celeste told him she had never directed anyone to pressure a landowner, that the acquisition files presented to her office showed a willing seller requesting minor concessions before signing. Rowan walked to the workbench and returned with a manila envelope. Inside were 4 letters on Whitmore Crown letterhead dated over the past 7 weeks, each one more direct about the consequences of refusal: environmental liability, zoning reclassification, state remediation orders that typically exceeded the property's market value. The last letter contained a digital signature on the authorization line. It was Celeste's signature, copied from her official executive seal and applied to a document she had never read. She recognized the shape of it, the way you recognize your own handwriting in someone else's forgery: correct in the obvious features, wrong in every small way that matters. They argued briefly and necessarily. Rowan said not knowing was not the same as not being responsible. The company had used her name to threaten a private citizen out of property his family had held for 5 decades, and whoever authorized it had counted on her name being credible enough that no one would look past it. She couldn't argue the logic. She could only tell him she intended to find out who had done it. Then she asked to use whatever phone he had to call local law enforcement, and Rowan, who had been crouching beside her car with a small flashlight, stood up and held a device the size of a matchbook between 2 fingers, a GPS transmitter. Attached to her underframe before she'd left the city, he asked quietly whether anyone had known she was driving to this location tonight. She thought of Marin Holloway. Then she checked her phone settings without connecting to any network and found a background process she hadn't installed, running silently and forwarding location data to a number she didn't recognize. Rowan switched off the flashlight. In the dark, Celeste put her phone face down on the counter and stood very still. The coat she'd been holding was bunched in her left hand, and when she set it down, something slipped from the inside pocket and fell to the floor with a small, dense sound. A memory card in a waterproof sleeve. Neither of them had put it there. Rowan found a battered laptop he'd been using for parts catalogs, and when he slotted the card in, the only file on it was a video, 4 minutes and 38 seconds, shot on a phone propped against a dashboard, the subject sitting in a parked car with no identifiable background. The man on screen was Elliot Crane, looking like someone who had not slept in several days and had made peace with what came next. He spoke directly and without drama. He identified himself, stated the date, and described a criminal fraud scheme that had been operating inside Whitmore Crown for at least 3 years, with the knowledge of Chief Operating Officer Archer Pembroke and the full cooperation of Silas Blackridge, chairman of Blackridge Capital and primary external financier of the Silver Ridge Project. Elliot laid it out like an auditor, not accusation but documentation. Archer and Silas had established a network of shell companies in the period between the Silver Ridge feasibility study and the first board presentation, quietly purchasing surrounding land parcels before any public announcement, acquiring them at prices that would multiply several times over once the resort's footprint was disclosed. The operation required one piece of land the shell network couldn't acquire through normal channels: the Hale Tract, which sat directly above the only viable route for a subsurface utility corridor the project's engineers had already specced as essential. Without that parcel, the project could not break ground on schedule, and without a scheduled groundbreaking, the phased financing structure Silas had arranged would begin to unravel. Elliot also said the actual environmental testing on the Hale property had shown no contamination of any kind. The reports appearing in the official project dossier had been substituted with fabricated documents showing moderate petroleum contamination, which would have given the state grounds to compel a forced sale at remediated value. He said physical copies of the original unaltered report, along with the shell company records and payment documentation, were hidden in a waterproof container beneath a false bottom in the base of pump number 4, which had not dispensed gasoline in over a decade. The container also held an encrypted phone Elliot had left there 3 days earlier when staying in the city was no longer safe. Rowan took a pry bar and they crossed the pump island in the rain. The base panel of the 4th pump came free after 4 careful minutes, and inside the false floor they found exactly what Elliot had described. The original environmental report with its certified stamp intact, an annotated printout of 18 shell company registrations, transaction records showing irregular payments routed through a payroll vendor, a spiral-bound maintenance ledger in the elder Hale's handwriting covering 30 years of station history, and the encrypted phone locked with a code neither of them knew. Celeste calculated that the board meeting Archer had requested was now approximately 9 hours away. Then a new message appeared on her screen from a sender identifier that read Marin Holloway, and it said 4 words, "Don't trust Rowan Hale." Celeste held the phone out so Rowan could read it. He said he had never heard Marin Holloway's name before 60 seconds ago. A second message arrived before she could respond. A photograph, time-stamped 3 weeks prior, showing a man at the pump island in daylight, speaking to Rowan through the window of a parked sedan. The man was Elliot Crane. Rowan was quiet for a moment, then said that an auditor matching that description had stopped by about a month ago, asking about the property's utility history and specifically about an old buried telephone line his father had leased to the Whitmore organization in the early 2000s. He had answered because the questions seemed routine and technical. He hadn't mentioned it because he hadn't known it was relevant, and because he understood without being told that a CEO walking into his garage at midnight might find a connection between a stranger's questions and a convenient body of evidence more easily than she would accept a straightforward explanation. Celeste crossed the garage and found the old analog telephone line box mounted on the back wall and used it to call Marin directly on a hard line, not running through any network she'd used in the past several hours. Marin spoke quickly. Archer Pembroke had called an emergency board session for 8 in the morning, 2 hours early. He had submitted a filing stating that Celeste was unreachable and displaying symptoms consistent with an acute psychological episode. He had a medical consultant prepared to testify. He had been building a paper trail of internal memos expressing concern about her judgment for at least 6 weeks, citing decisions either exaggerated or fabricated wholesale. As for the warning she'd sent about Rowan, Marin explained that Gavin's team had placed a monitoring relay on her phone 2 days ago. She had sent the deliberately ambiguous message, knowing Gavin would read it and conclude she was feeding Celeste misinformation rather than helping her. The ruse had bought roughly an hour. Outside the boarded window, Rowan held up 2 fingers. The headlights were back, 4 vehicles now, one of them a white truck with a county seal. Rowan said they couldn't stay, and the only vehicle on the property without a tracking device was the flatbed tow truck his father had used for breakdown calls, currently in the middle of restoration and not driven on a highway in 15 years. He said the engine had turned over the last time he'd tried it. He said they should probably go. The flatbed started on the 3rd attempt, shuddering to life with a sound like something deciding to cooperate against its better judgment. Rowan loaded the waterproof box into the locked tool bay and pulled out through the back of the property along a service track connecting to a forestry access road half a mile east, running without headlights until they were clear of the fence line. Celeste told him she could compensate him for his time and the risk he was taking, naming a figure. Rowan didn't respond to the number. He looked at the road and said that taking money from Whitmore Crown in exchange for helping a Whitmore Crown executive would not change what the company had done to him, and he was not interested in the transaction. He said he would drive her to the city and stand beside the evidence he'd been holding without knowing what it was, and in exchange he had 3 conditions: a public independent inquiry into every land acquisition tied to Silver Ridge, a clean environmental assessment of the Hale property filed on public record, and if the evidence showed the company had acted wrongfully, a formal public acknowledgement, not a settlement, not a non-disclosure agreement. Celeste said she agreed to all 3. They drove without speaking for a while. Rowan told her about June without sentiment, the sketches on napkins, the combinations of garage and diner and relay station, June's idea that the most frightening part of any long drive was not the destination but the stretch in between, the miles where no one knew where you were. Celeste listened, and then said her father had left her a company built across 3 generations that came with debts she hadn't created and alliances she'd never chosen, and she had spent her first year proving she was strong enough for the role that she had stopped checking whether the people around her were who they appeared to be. Rowan reached across without looking from the road and set a dry work jacket on her lap. Later, when he cut his knuckle on a wire connector under the dash, she found a roll of cloth tape in the tool shelf without being asked and wrapped the cut. Neither of them made much of it. The radio crackled with Gavin Rourke's voice, terse and operational. Hale was driving her toward the city, cover every major route in. Rowan turned the radio down, not off. He said they needed to not be on any major route. At a gravel pull-off beside an equipment lot about 12 miles outside the city, Rowan stopped and spent 4 minutes transferring the GPS transmitter from Celeste's abandoned car to the undercarriage of a freight hauler, sitting with its engine running, waiting on a loading confirmation. The hauler was heading east. Gavin's team would follow the signal in the wrong direction for at least 40 minutes. Rowan turned them northwest on a county maintenance road that ran parallel to the highway, accessible only to vehicles with enough clearance. They had a window. The volunteer fire station where Rowan had once maintained the radio relay systems was dark and unmanned through the night. He still had a key. Inside, he connected Elliot's encrypted phone through an offline diagnostic protocol that the device's security architecture apparently recognized as a legitimate access route. Elliot had built in a backup unlock method designed for exactly this kind of off-grid recovery. And the phone came alive. The audio file was 41 minutes long. 2 voices, the ambient ease of men accustomed to being the only opinions that matter. One was Archer Pembroke's. The other was older and carried the confidence of someone so thoroughly separated from the operational details of his interests that he genuinely believed himself above any specific consequence. Silas Blackridge discussed removing Celeste, not as a hypothetical but as a scheduled event, discussed the mechanism by which Whitmore Crown's remaining liquidity would be absorbed by cost overruns he'd built into the financing structure, discussed the acquisition price. The recording was damning in content but technically imperfect. Ambient noise made speaker identification difficult to a legal standard without corroborating data. Celeste said they needed the original uncompressed audio, which Elliot had implied was stored on the backup server Whitmore Crown maintained near the Silver Ridge Zone, connected via the old leased telephone line running directly through the Hale property. The line that Archer's demolition team had been scheduled to destroy, along with the junction box below the station garage, at 7 in the morning. Celeste's phone lit with an official notification from the board secretary. The meeting had been moved up to 7:30. The preliminary vote to authorize her suspension had already been called. Marin's message came through the fire station landline 14 minutes later. Archer had presented the board with a consolidated file attributing every aspect of the pressure campaign against Silver Ridge landowners to Celeste personally. The threatening letters, the falsified environmental reports, the payments to document fabricators, all routed through an executive discretionary account bearing her name. The account had been set up 2 years earlier, during the period when Celeste had been delegating heavily while managing her father's final illness, authorized as part of a routine administrative package Archer had brought to the hospital for her to sign. Its transactions had been invisible in her financial review because the amounts had been coded as vendor disbursements. Archer was not simply trying to remove Celeste from leadership. He was constructing her as the architect of a fraud she'd had no part in creating, positioning her to absorb the legal liability when the scheme eventually collapsed. Rowan had been rereading his father's maintenance ledger. He set it open at an entry from 19 years earlier and pointed to a paragraph in the elder Hale's precise handwriting, a record of the telephone relay installation, its maintenance schedule, and a note indicating that the Whitmore Crown legal office had confirmed the relay connection included access to the company's regional backup storage node as part of a long-term lease. The backup node had never been decommissioned because decommissioning it would have required acknowledging the lease was still active, which would have surfaced in the acquisition review. Celeste had ordered when she took the CEO role. Whoever had arranged the demolition at 7 in the morning had not done it to destroy the building. They had done it to sever the only physical connection to the storage node, still containing the original server-authenticated recordings. Celeste looked at the demolition permit time, looked at the station clock, and said they had just under 90 minutes. Rowan told Celeste to stay with Marin at the fire station. She said she wasn't going to do that. She said she had spent years at a remove from the consequences of decisions made in her name, and she was not willing to send someone else into danger created by her company while she waited at a safe distance. He looked at her for a moment and picked up his keys. They came back to Hale's last stop through the forest track, headlights off for the last quarter mile, and found the property ringed with temporary fencing and a county advisory board citing environmental hazard. Archer's demolition contractor had arrived early but had stopped at the boundary, unable to begin without the property owner's secondary confirmation signature that county ordinance required. Rowan was the property owner. He walked to the fence and told the supervisor he would not be signing anything tonight, and that an executive authorization from a company in the middle of a contested board proceeding was not a court order. Archer arrived 11 minutes later with Gavin and 2 cars, wearing a suit that looked wrong for 4 in the morning. He spoke to Celeste with the tone of a man finishing a conversation he'd been having in his head for months. The most sensible thing she could do was hand over the storage device and accept a negotiated exit. Marin, standing behind Celeste, had opened a secure video connection, routing the entire confrontation in real time to a notary public in Philadelphia and a representative from the State Attorney General's office. Celeste said clearly and on record that the demolition permit had been issued fraudulently using her executive authority without her knowledge or consent, and that she was formally revoking it as sitting CEO. While Celeste held the legal argument at the fence line, Rowan slipped through the service gate at the north side and went under the building through the maintenance crawl space. He knew where every junction was in the dark. The relay box was in a steel housing at the intersection of the original telephone trench and the utility corridor, and beside it, exactly where Elliot's message had implied, was a solid-state drive in a sealed aluminum housing connected by a single cable. He disconnected it, pocketed it, and was moving back toward the access gate when he heard Gavin enter the crawlspace behind him. There was no room for a confrontation. Rowan moved through 3 service hatches in sequence, bolting each behind him, and emerged through a floor panel in the storage annex. Behind a shelving unit Gavin had no way of knowing was there. He came around the front of the building and handed Celeste the drive and said quietly that Elliot had left one more file on it, a video addressed specifically to her. They watched it on Marin's laptop in the gravel outside the station. Elliot looked exhausted in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for longer than it was ever meant to be held. He confirmed everything in the earlier video and named Archer and Silas directly and clearly and on a timestamp. Then he said something he had not said before, with the care of a man who understands that the truth he is about to deliver will cause pain and has decided to deliver it anyway. He said that Celeste's father, in the final year of his life, had been informed of an early version of Archer's arrangement with Silas, not the full scope of it, but enough to understand that something irregular was occurring in the Silver Ridge financing. He had asked Archer about it privately. Archer had framed it as a minor conflict of interest already corrected. Celeste's father had accepted this explanation without escalating, because escalating would have required a formal board disclosure that would have revealed the depth of the liquidity problems he had been managing quietly for nearly a decade. He had made the calculation that powerful men who build things over long periods are prone to making when the alternative is watching those things come undone. He had chosen the company's image over its integrity, and in doing so had left the door open for everything that followed. Celeste stood outside the old station in the last hour before dawn, and was very still for a long time. The weight of it was not primarily the legal complication. It was the loss of a specific version of her father, the version she had been working, without fully knowing it, to equal and eventually surpass. Rowan said nothing for a while. When he spoke, he said that inheriting a system built on compromises you didn't make didn't mean you were those compromises. He said the difference was what you did with the information once you had it. He said it plainly and without effort to comfort, and that made it land more completely than softness would have. Archer, from across the fence, offered Celeste a private arrangement. Hand over the drive, and he would ensure she kept her title after Silas completed his acquisition. She refused without deliberation. Marin reported that the full video had already been copied to an independent server. Archer's leverage was gone. Gavin Rourke, who had remained near the fence throughout, set a folder on the hood of one of the cars, and said he would be providing the board with a complete command log of every written instruction he had received over the past 6 months, in exchange for a cooperation agreement. He looked at Archer when he said it, and didn't look away. Marin's phone buzzed. The board had completed its preliminary vote. Celeste had been suspended. Silas Blackridge was one counter-signature away from operational authority over Whitmore Crown Development. Marin said they had roughly 90 minutes before the final signature could be filed. The Whitmore Crown headquarters building was not designed for entrances made by people who had spent the night in a drainage pit and a crawl space and a flatbed truck from the previous century. Celeste walked through it anyway, with Rowan behind her carrying the sealed drive and Marin beside her, with the expression of someone who has done the legal architecture for this moment and is prepared to defend every beam of it. The board secretary said she was not authorized to enter the meeting. Marin pointed out that the authorization for the suspension had been voted on in a session called under emergency powers, invoked on the basis of fabricated documents, which meant the session's procedural validity was itself subject to challenge, which meant the suspension had not yet taken legal effect, which meant Celeste Whitmore was still CEO, and was entitled to address the board on any matter she chose to raise. Archer said the matter was already decided. Celeste sat down at the table and said she agreed, almost decided, and she wanted to be present for the rest of it. She did not open with a defense of herself. She told the board she had run a company for 14 months while operating on information that had been filtered, shaped, and in some cases invented by people she had trusted, and that this was her failure as an executive, and she was not asking them to overlook it. The question before them was not whether Whitmore Crown had done harm. It had, and she was responsible for the organization that had done it. But whether they were going to allow the people who had constructed that harm to complete their acquisition of the company under the cover of a board process they had corrupted. Rowan set the drive on the table and said nothing. Marin connected it to the display system and walked through the evidence with surgical sequence. The forged letters with Celeste's copied signature, the original environmental report against the falsified version, the shell company registrations traced through overnight financial analysis to the Blackridge Family Trust, the payment records, the maintenance ledger establishing the backup server connection, the authenticated audio recording, and Elliot Crane's 2 video statements played in full with timestamp data visible. Silas Blackridge said the recording was inadmissible. Marin said admissibility was a courtroom standard, not a boardroom standard, and asked whether the board wanted their names on the record as having ratified this outcome with this documentation in front of them. Archer turned toward Silas and began a sentence that started with the words, "given the circumstances." Gavin set a folder on the table and said he would be providing a complete command log of every instruction he had received in writing over the past 6 months. He looked at Archer when he said it. The board voted to invalidate the suspension proceeding and table the Silver Ridge approval. They authorized an immediate third-party audit of all land acquisition practices and referred Archer Pembroke's conduct to independent counsel with a recommendation for criminal referral. Silas Blackridge left the room before the vote was formally recorded and did not get his countersignature. Celeste sat at the head of the table after the others had filed out and made the hardest decision of her tenure. She suspended the Silver Ridge project entirely, accepting the financial penalty that came with the delay. The company's debt position would worsen before it improved. Some assets would need to be sold. She had fought for this role with the whole of herself, and the first major thing she'd done with the authority it gave her was trade a billion-dollar project for the right to be honest about what her company had done. Rowan had been standing near the door for most of the session, present but peripheral, which appeared to be exactly where he was most comfortable. As the room cleared, he picked up the empty drive casing and walked toward the elevator. Celeste said his name. He turned. She said the work between them wasn't finished. He asked what work she meant. She said the 3 conditions he'd named on the road, and everything they implied, and that she intended to follow through on all of it before he drove back up that mountain. He said he knew. He pushed the elevator button. She said she'd be in touch. He said she knew where to find him. 6 months passed in the efficient, unglamorous way that accountability actually happens. Not in scenes of confrontation, but in depositions, disclosures, and filings, in meetings with attorneys and investigators and county officials, in the slow restoration of records that had been altered. Archer Pembroke was indicted on 9 counts, including fraud, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. Silas Blackridge faced a parallel federal investigation into a shell company network that had been operating across multiple real estate projects in 4 states. The environmental assessments conducted on 15 affected properties found no significant contamination, exactly what the original uncorrupted reports had shown. 17 property owners received formal letters from Whitmore Crown Development, signed by Celeste, acknowledging what had been done and offering independent appraisals and compensation where applicable. Rowan did not accept money. He accepted one thing: a public filing of the clean assessment report, permanent and unredacted, attached to the property deed. The Silver Ridge project was eventually redesigned, smaller, quieter, oriented toward the natural geography of the site rather than against it. It did not require the Hale Tract at all. A repositioned utility corridor running along an already cleared easement handled the infrastructure without touching the old station property. Celeste approved every line item of the redesign herself. Hale's last stop reopened on a Saturday in early November, unannounced. The restoration had produced something not quite identical to June's napkin sketches, but carrying the same feeling: a working garage with a modest service bay, a counter with 6 stools and a short menu, a pair of rapid charging stations under the original Pump Island overhang, and a compact radio relay unit mounted outside connecting to the county emergency network. The walls had been stripped back to the original cinder block and finished in warm white that caught the afternoon light in a way the old dark paneling never had. That morning, before the doors opened, Avery came in and moved through the space with the ease of someone returning to a place she had imagined for a long time, and she hung a photograph at the end of the counter nearest the window. A candid shot of June Hale sitting in the grass outside on a summer day, laughing at something off-camera, her hand raised to shade her eyes from the light. Rowan looked at it for a while and didn't say anything, and Avery put her arm through his, and they stood together in the quiet of the finished space until the first car pulled off the road outside. Celeste arrived midday without a driver or an assistant, wearing clothes that were clearly her own. She sat at the stool nearest the window, the same position, more or less, where Rowan had pulled her behind the counter on the night that had changed the shape of both their lives, and drank the coffee and did not look at her phone. When the counter quieted, she asked him something she had been holding for a while: why he had helped her that night, knowing her name, knowing what the company had done, having more than enough reason to walk away. Rowan dried his hands and considered it the way he considered most things: actually doing it rather than performing it. He said he hadn't helped a CEO. He had been in his own building working on something that mattered to him, and he had looked out and seen a person standing in the rain who was frightened and alone. He said that was the whole of it. Celeste turned her coffee cup slowly on the counter. She asked if he wanted to have dinner sometime, after the station closed. He said he thought he probably did, but she was going to have to help clear the tables. She said that was fair. Outside, the November afternoon went gray early the way it does in the Pennsylvania hills when the season has made up its mind. A car slowed at the edge of the lot and then turned in and pulled up under the overhang, and a man got out and looked at the building with the slightly uncertain expression of a traveler who has spotted something he wasn't expecting to find. He pushed open the door and the warm air came out to meet him, and he asked, still half reading the sign, whether the place was still open. Rowan reached up and switched on the old neon sign behind the counter. The letters flickered once, then settled into a steady amber glow that pushed back against the gray outside. *open. The station that had once swallowed Celeste Whitmore whole in the dark. The place she had run toward in desperation and fear, the place where the world had tried to erase her, was lit now from the inside, warm enough to be seen from the road, steady enough to stay.